السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد، فقال ربنا تعالى في كلامه المجيد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وهذه آية أنتم تعرفونها. This is a verse which you very likely all of you know. And the verse goes like this: إن الإنسان لا يطغى أن رآه استغنى. إن الإنسان لا يطغى أن رآه استغنى. I'm going to come back to this verse and the relevance of this verse to the life of the protagonist of our discussion today, Al-Imam Al-Ghazali, who was given the honorific epithet Hujjatul Islam. Hujjah in Arabic is a word which means the proof, the person who can convince us that Islam is the truth. And because of his scholarly accolades and his masterful writings and his immense intelligence, and in later life the wisdom and the spiritual awakening that he experienced and which he left behind him as a legacy, he is known today to be one of the greatest scholars in Islamic history. So let's look at why that is so. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about the relevance of Al-Imam Al-Ghazali today. Why is his life and his works relevant today? And the reason for this, and the thing that has come into stark contrast in this lockdown and in the self-reflection and the introspection that we've experienced owing to the lockdown, is what makes us do the things we do in our lives today. What motivates us? And we look around us and we find ourselves in what I call a neo-paganistic world. In the old days, people who were pagans, they used to worship abstractions of themselves. If you look at the Greek gods, each Greek god was really a demigod, a superhero, if you like, a superman or a superwoman, and they used to give them reified and aggrandized powers. So they used to give them super strength and super speed and super knowledge, and they used to worship these figments of their imagination. But in essence, they were worshipping themselves. They're worshipping an idea of man. In today's neo-paganistic world, we have a similar form of shirk, but it's slightly more sophisticated. We worship man, but we worship man in a more abstracted form. We don't usually have physical idols, though we do have idols, and they are often quite physical, such as sports stars and musicians. But we worship the idea of being a human being, and that's the sophistication of it, and that's how it can insidiously find itself in our own vernacular. We can find ourselves using the words and the language and the system and the genre and the paradigm of neo-paganism, even when we talk about Islam. So when we talk about human rights, we talk about human rights. Why? Because the discourse of human rights today is based on the belief in the supremacy of the human being, whereas an Islamic discourse of human rights would be based on our understanding that there are rights of God over us and there are rights of man in relation to other men as slaves of God. So we have a vertical relationship, whereas the modern paganistic discourse of human rights is completely horizontal. There is no vertical, there is no sacred aspect to it, there is no relationship with the divine. And sometimes when we buy into certain discourses and paradigms in modern parlance and in the modern vernacular, we tend to forget that our tradition is based on an iconoclastic view of idols. This is very, very important. When the Prophet Muhammed, when he went to Mecca, he banished the idols, he broke them, the way Ibrahim ﷺ destroyed the idols. And Al-Imam Al-Ghazali was in essence an iconoclast. He came to destroy the idol of the self, the human ego, or what we call the nafs, because that is the source from which paganism derives. I'm going to go into more about that and the relevance of Al-Imam Al-Ghazali today, and we're going to look at some extracts from his book or his opus magnus, Ihya Ulum Al-din, later, and we're also going to talk a little bit about his other intellectual achievements. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about his biography. So I'm going to split our discussion today into 3 parts. I'm going to follow the sunnah of 3 parts. In Arabic, we call this tathlith. Yeah, so something that is muthallath. Muthallath is also the word for triangle. Something that is muthallath is something that's done in 3s. So, for example, when we do wudu, we purify ourselves and we wash each of the parts of our body that we wash as a representation or an outward manifestation of an inward purification. Al-Imam Al-Ghazali talks a lot about that in part of his Ihya. And we do it in 3s. So there's a sunnah of doing things in 3s. So I'm going to follow the sunnah of wudu, the sunnah of purification, in the seminar today. So in the first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about Al-Imam Al-Ghazali's biography and why that was important and its relevance today. Secondly, I'm going to go into some of the language that he uses in the khutbah of his book, of his kitab Al-Uzlah, of his book on seclusion. And I'm going to look at specific words and just the mastery, because Imam Al-Ghazali was a famous rhetorician. He uses language masterfully. We're going to look at some of the beauty of that language and try to derive some spiritual nourishment from understanding the meanings of some of his words. And then in the third part, I'm going to look at the Kitab al-Uzlah specifically and look at some of the key points he makes of the benefits. He talks about the benefits, the fawaid, and the afat. The afat are the dangers or the risks of uzlah, because uzlah or seclusion can also come with certain risks, and we've got to be aware of those too. I don't think we'll have time to go into those. We'll go into 3 of the key benefits of seclusion that he mentions in the Ihya. So firstly, Al-Imam Al-Ghazali was born at the head of the 6th century of the Islamic calendar, and he was born to a very simple household. His father was a humble weaver. However, his father's role in his life is very, very important. And his father didn't spend a long time in his company. His father died while he was still quite young, he and his brother Ahmed. But his father, despite not being a man of knowledge himself, was a man who loved the people of knowledge. So he would always support the people of knowledge, and he wanted his sons to become young men of knowledge. So when he passed away, he put them in the care of a very pious man, and he gave him a pot of money for their education. So it's really important to understand the role of parents in the nurturing of scholarship and the nurturing of spirituality in children. This is the first lesson we can learn from his early life. From his teenage life, we learn another very, very important lesson, and that is he had the opportunity, and it was, you might call it chance, although we don't believe in chance, because we believe in something we call tawfiq. The word tawfiq in Arabic comes from waffaqa yuwaffiqu. It's the verbal noun, tawfiq, or you may say waffaqa comes from tawfiq. And tawfiq means the coming together of 2 things. So it's Allah who brings together you and your destiny. He does tawfiq between you and what happens to you, his decisions for you in your life. This is tawfiq. And if Allah's decision for you is that you will succeed, then that is your tawfiq. So this is the meaning of tawfiq. Tawfiq is not a word like in English. The word tawfiq or the word success suggests that it's I who is successful. Whereas in Arabic, the word for success and Islamic tradition and our aqeedah and our beliefs are interlaced with our words in Arabic. Arabic is a sacred language for that reason. The word tawfiq reminds us of our utter dependence upon Allah's command in our lives. So he had the tawfiq to study with one of the greatest scholars, one of the greatest minds in Islamic history, Al-Imam Al-Juwayni. And Al-Imam Al-Juwayni found him to be a very, very motivated and keen student. And he very quickly taught him everything he knew. So it came to a point in his very early age where Al-Imam Al-Juwayni had taken him through all of the stages, and he studied grammar, he mastered logic. In fact, one of his first books was on logic. So he was a logician. he was a great, as I said, a great rhetorician, and he was a rhetorician both in Arabic and Persian. Yeah, and when we look at his works, we'll see how he brings out spiritual meanings through the use of his words, through the extraordinary imagery and metaphor and linguistic style and linguistic tropes. So Imam Al-Ghazali became very, very quickly a very brilliant mind. And Al-Imam Al-Juwayni famously said about Al-Imam Al-Ghazali that you can drown in the ocean of his knowledge. And some say that was a double-edged compliment. And I'm going to come back to that in a bit, and how this comment actually helps us to understand something that happened a bit later in Al-Imam Al-Ghazali's life. But the key second lesson we learn from his life is that a life that is focused and turned towards Allah must have spiritual nourishment at a young age. And so Al-Imam Al-Ghazali not only studied spirituality and tazkiyah, which some people call tasawwuf, at a young age, so not only studied the technical sciences, the ulum, but he also studied the spiritual sciences. And this brings us a little bit to how he starts writing the Ihya. So when you get to talking about the Ihya, we learn that the first book, so the Ihya is divided into 4 parts. He calls each part a ruba', a quarter, and each ruba' has 10 chapters. So there's 40 chapters altogether, and there's a great tradition in some parts of the Muslim world where they read a chapter of the Ihya each day, and they complete it in 40 days, and then they start reading it again. And this way it infuses their lives with all the meanings and messages of the Ihya. But the first chapter of the first quarter is called Kitab Ilm, and in this chapter he talks about the different types of knowledge. So when I talk about the Ihya, I'm going to go into the different types of knowledge. But the key point I'd like to draw out of that is in Arabic and in Islamic tradition, we have 2 words for knowledge. We have the word ilm, which many of you have heard of, and we also have the word ma'rifah. So ilm you might call mind knowledge, and ma'rifah is heart knowledge. And mind knowledge without heart knowledge is useless, and heart knowledge without mind knowledge can lead us into distraction, can lead us astray. It's very important to have both of those knowledges combined and married together in our education system. And this is what someone like Al-Imam Al-Juwayni gave to Imam Al-Ghazali, because not only was he a master of the outward sciences, he was also a master of the inward sciences. And from a young age, Al-Imam Al-Ghazali was nurtured in the science of tasawwuf, or spirituality. So that's the second lesson that we learn from Al-Imam Al-Ghazali's life. The third lesson we're going to learn in his adult life. Okay, so we're going to do things in 3s today. We're going to follow the sunnah of 3s. The first lesson, as I said, was the importance of loving and caring parents who care for scholars and who care for knowledge. Lesson number 2, the importance of being nurtured by scholars from a young age and having our spiritual and our intellectual minds nourished through exposure and the company of scholars. The third lesson we're going to learn is in his later life, he grows to become one of the greatest scholars in Islamic history at the time. So at the time, he was known as a master in his field. In fact, at quite a young age, he was appointed as the lead scholar in the Nizamiya Madrasa in Baghdad. So his trajectory takes him along to the palace of one of the ministers at the time, and his name was Nizamul Mulk. And he plays a very important role in Imam Al-Ghazali's rise and in his career as a scholar. So Nizam al-Mulk very quickly recognizes the brilliance of Al-Imam Al-Ghazali, and he promotes him, and he asks him to become a polemicist. So he gives him a place in Baghdad. He appoints him in his 30s. In fact, he becomes the head of the Nizamiya. In today's terms, that would be equivalent to a young man in their 30s becoming the dean or the chancellor or whatever the word is of the University of Oxford or Harvard. that's the magnitude of his achievement, of his intellectual achievement at a young age. So he begins to write for the ruler or the governor in the area, and he becomes what you might call in today's terms a scholar for dollar, right? I don't mean that to be in a deprecating way, but he becomes a gun for hire for the local scholar, and he begins to write polemics. The reason for this is Nizam al-Mulk had an agenda, and he wanted to establish a Sunni normativity, because Sunni Islam at the time was challenged by other forms of knowledges or paradigms or discourses or systems of belief. And two of those, and this is very, very relevant to today, two of those are the same challenges that we face today. The first was the challenge from what they called at the time the Dahriyun. The word Dahr in Arabic means time. So if you have your hands up, if you could please write your question into the chat, then I'll see it on my panel here, please, inshallah. So the Dahriyun were essentially the materialists, the people at the time who today you might call secularists. In those days, you couldn't really be an outward secularist in the Muslim world or even in the Christian world or in most parts of the world. So the secularists at the time used to couch their discourse or their arguments within the paradigm or the discourse of religion. But however, if you took their arguments to their logical conclusions, they would result in a secular or a non-spiritual outcome. They'd result in a materialistic view of the world. So Al-Imam Al-Ghazali started writing polemics and debunking the secularists of the time, the Dahriyun. The second group of people that he started to debunk were the Batiniya. So there was a trend at the time, which you could call in today's terms the esoterics. So this goes into philosophy of knowledge, epistemology. So the Dahriyun believe that knowledge, the sum of knowledge, is what we can collect through our five senses. Yeah, so sense data is the sum of our knowledge. In today's terms, you might call that science, although today's word science is actually quite unscientific in the sense that it does not recognize spirituality as a science. And I'm going to explain to you what I mean by that, because spirituality in the Islamic tradition is called ilm al-tasawwuf or ilm al-tazkiyah, or there are various other terms for it. Those are two key terms. Spirituality is called an ilm, a science, an outward science. Yeah, it's the ilm of ma'rifah, ilm al-ma'rifah, the science of knowing God. And you may think, well, that's an oxymoron, that's a paradox, that doesn't make sense. How can spirituality, which appears irrational, and science, which we consider to be rational, be reconciled? I'm going to go into that in a bit and explain to you what the Islamic scholars mean by that, including Al-Imam Al-Ghazali. And so we have three competing ideas of knowledge, three epistemologies: the outward people, the people of outward knowledge, and the deniers of inward knowledge at one extreme. And at the other extreme, at the polar end, we have the Batiniya, who say that there is something called secret knowledge. And that secret knowledge is only accessible to a select few who are chosen by God. So it's not accessible to you and me. They have to be from a certain tribe. For example, they might have to be from the family of the Prophet Muhammed, or they have to be given certain dispensations by those people. And the Batiniya made certain arguments about knowledge, and they said that, well, these people have this secret knowledge, and the only way to access it is to go to them and just follow what they say. That's their religion. So you had this outwardness extreme and an inwardness extreme, and he wrote polemics against both of these, and his arguments were that the third epistemology, which is this epistemology of what we call tasawwuf, or of experiential psycho-spirituality. You could call it experiential psycho-spirituality or experiential psychology, experimental, in fact. Today we have a discipline called experimental psychology. So the Muslims were way ahead of their time. Tasawwuf is essentially experimental psychology. In fact, I had an experience myself when I was studying out in the Middle East, and I went with my teacher out onto the mountains, and we were at the top of a cliff. Effectively, it was a kind of a top of a mountain or a hill, looking down into a valley, and then on the other side of the valley you could see the city with all its lights on. This was after Maghrib, and it looked very beautiful because all the houses were clad in white and they're all lit up, and it was a beautiful scene. And he said to me, you know, Salman, all of that you see before you is real, but it's illusory. It's an illusion because it has no subsistence or reality in and of itself. It relies upon Allah's hukum of kun fayakun, of kun, so it is, in every moment of its existence. The moment Allah's hukum of kun is withdrawn and He gives it the hukum of being destroyed, it will cease to exist. And then he said, your experience of Allah is imaginary. It's in your imagination, but it's real. So we understand from this that spirituality is a process that we experience in our imaginations. Sometimes it has manifestations. We have something called kashf or mukashafat. I'm going to come to that as a source of knowledge, because some people might say, well, the Batiniya, they're claiming that certain people of knowledge can gain knowledge through kashf or mukashafat, or unveilings, where Allah gives knowledge to specific people through an unveiling, through removing the veils of physicality, so that they see things that other people don't see. For example, the Prophet Muhammed had an experience where he went to Mi'raj, and he had that experience, nobody else had that experience. And we believe in our aqidah that karamatul awliya haqqun, that the karamat, or the miracles, if you like, not the prophetic miracles, but the miracles Allah gives at the hands of scholars, are true. This is our belief. So sometimes we can get this confusion between the Batiniya and the Mukashafat. I'm going to explain that there's a very clear distinction between those two. Why? Because the Mukashafat are simply milestones, or just experiences that a person has, that anybody can have, so long as they follow a certain path and do certain actions with certain preconditions, which is why, as you know, it's scientific, because science means, or the scientific method is, if something can be replicated by repetition and you get the same results, then we call this science, right? It's a very simple explanation of science. So spirituality in that sense, or tasawwuf or tazkiyah, is therefore a science or an ilm, and it is different to the Batiniya. This is very important. And what Imam Al-Ghazali does in his book Ihya is he talks about the science of tasawwuf, but he's not interested in mukashafat. This is not a book about miracles. You do get books about miracles. Some people do write about spiritual experiences and things that happen in their lives. And many of us, we have these experiences in our own lives. We have small miracles, and each of these is a karamat. On one occasion, I was sitting with my teacher, and he said to us, if you see a karama happen in the presence of your sheikh, then you should ignore it, because we don't worship karamat. We worship Allah. We worship al-haq, the real. We don't worship spiritual experiences, because the spiritual world is just another creation of Allah, just like the physical world. The spiritual world has its own laws of physics, or should we say its own laws of spirits or spirituality, just like the physical world has its laws of physics. If you follow the laws of physics, you will achieve certain results. If you follow the laws of the spiritual world, you will achieve spiritual results. And we don't worship the physical world, and neither do we worship the spiritual world. We worship Allah. So those people who follow the tale of miracles are potentially suffering great distraction. So the Shaykh said, ignore them. very soon after that, one day we were back in that same valley, me and a few others. We used to go down there after Fajr, we used to go for a walk, go down halfway down the valley, and we used to sit on some rocks and do our adhkar until the sun rose. And while we were there, it was still quite dark, because after Fajr in the Middle East, it's still quite dark. Suddenly we were attacked by two groups of dogs. One from this side, one from that side. And they were barking, and they looked ferocious, terrifying. And a few lessons before that day, the Shaykh had said to us that if you are remembering Allah, if you are remembering Allah with your heart and your mind, then no harm can come upon you. So I thought to myself, right, I'm going to implement the lesson of the Shaykh. I'm going to close my eyes and just focus on my adhkar, because if I'm in Allah's care, no harm can come upon me. You've got to believe that. This is called yaqeen. You've got to try to believe that as much as you can. After a few minutes, because there was a racket going on, dogs barking on both sides. After a few minutes, I heard the Shaykh get up, and then I opened my eyes, and he picked up a stone, and he recited something. He blew over the stone, and he threw it towards one of the pack of dogs. The moment the stone hit the ground, there was pin drop silence. Both sets of dogs just stopped barking, and they just gently turned around, and they walked away in different directions. And the reason why I'm telling you the story is not for you to go off and think about the story, but paradoxically, I'm telling you the story to tell you that that story is not important, because we are not about telling miracle stories or transmitting them. So although I've told you the story, and it might sound a bit paradoxical, I'm telling you the story to emphasize to you that that's not important. And so the first thought that came to my mind is, I need to ask the Shaykh what he recited. because you want to ask questions about this. You've just seen some you've seen a karama that Allah has performed in his presence, and I had to withhold my desire, because that's my nafs wanting to know about the physical or the spiritual world, wants to be distracted by the beauty of the scenery, whereas what I should be focusing on is my own adhkar and my own presence with Allah. So Al-Imam Al-Ghazali, when he talks about tasawwuf or spirituality or tazkiyah in the Ihya, he's not talking about mukashafat, he's talking about something else. I'm going to keep you in a little bit of suspense, I'm going to come back to that in a bit. So one more thing about his life before we move on to the Ihya, and that is, on one occasion he was traveling. Actually, two more things. On one occasion he was traveling, and he got robbed. This is a famous story. He got robbed, and he begged the robber, he begged the brigand. He said, please, please, please take everything you like, but leave my books behind. I've spent 3 years collecting this knowledge. All my knowledge is in those books. And the thief looked at him and laughed. He said, what sort of knowledge is this, if a thief can steal it? And Al-Imam Al-Ghazali says, that was an experience, and I'm convinced that Allah sent this person to me. Allah sent this person to me to tell me about the fact that I was not memorizing my knowledge. So from that day onwards, although he did carry books, he made it a point to memorize every single thing that he knew. And this is important for all of us, and I emphasize this a lot to all of my students, and that is, when you memorize something, that knowledge starts to have a life inside your mind. It's very different to knowledge that's static and ossified inside a book. When that knowledge is inside your mind, that knowledge starts to interact with other knowledges inside your mind, and then it develops into new knowledges. Allah teaches you while that knowledge is passively ticking away in your mind. And I was listening to, or I was reading one of the poems of Al-Imam Al-Shafi'i once. He has a little diwan of poetry. He didn't write a lot of poetry. He was a great linguist and wrote many books, but he didn't write much poetry. So there's a small diwan by Al-Imam Al-Shafi'i, and in that diwan he lists the asbab, or the causes of knowledge. What causes knowledge to increase? And in that book, one of the causes, this surprised me as a young man, it surprised me to read this. He said, one of the causes of knowledge is mudiyu zaman, the passing of time. The passing of time causes your knowledge to increase. And I thought to myself, well, if I'm just lounging around, sitting around, how can that cause my knowledge to increase? For example, if I'm resting or I'm sleeping, how can that passing of time cause my knowledge to increase? And as I understood this further, I realized that actually, if you imbue yourself, if you imbibe that knowledge, you memorize it, then Allah gives that knowledge interaction with other knowledges, and you can wake up in the morning and have more knowledge. You can come up with new ideas. You can come up with, the knowledge plays Lego with itself, if you like, in your mind, and it develops into new paradigms. So he began to memorize everything he knew. So let's go back to his career, and he becomes the head scholar in the Nizamiya Madrasa. People from all over the world would come. There would be hundreds of people in the masjid, because all the lessons at the time used to happen in the masjid, in the masajid. On one occasion, he went to the masjid, all of his students, and his students, many of them were themselves notable scholars. The notable scholars were his students. He looked at all of his students and he couldn't speak. He was completely and utterly incapable of speaking. He got what you might call speaker's block. Now, think about it. It was his tongue that had risen him to success, because at that time, it was all about the delivery. Not only could he deliver the knowledge, but he could deliver it beautifully. It was his tongue that, if you think of this as physical causation, it was his tongue that took him to the height of his career. And at the height of his career, it was his tongue that became tied and prevented him from speaking. And at that moment, he had this personal crisis. Later, he writes in his autobiography, and when we do the follow-up courses on this, we'll look at his autobiography, which is called Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, the savior from going astray, because he later believed that he was going astray, even though he was such a great scholar, even though he was a master in many of the sciences. In fact, Al-Imam Al-Ghazali, in terms of the ulum or the Islamic sciences, is known most for his book Al-Mustasfa on Usul. So he was a great usuli who wrote this magnificent book called Al-Mustasfa, which is considered even to this day by many scholars to be the best book ever written on usul al-fiqh. All right, so he rose to this height, and on that day he had this crisis. And he also later talks about himself, and he says that I had become unbearable, because he became a person who you could not have an argument with. He never lost an argument in his life. And so he was a logician, he was a master of words, and he was a great scholar of great knowledge. Nobody could get any word sideways across him. And so he says in his own words, he became unbearable. And at that point, he has his personal crisis, and he feels that he's a phony. He feels that he's a fake, he's a fraud. He's got all of this outward accolades, but in reality, deep inside, he does not have presence with Allah. Right. So at that point, he leaves the Nizamiya, he leaves everything behind. And this is the ultimate test. You know, we can all have a crisis. Every now and then we have a crisis. We have a midlife crisis or an early life crisis or a late life crisis, and we feel that we're a phony and nothing's right. And then we wake up the next morning and it's life back to normal. We put the tie on, the shirt on, the jacket on, and go back to work. For him, this crisis meant that he had to leave his job. He had to leave his career. In today's terms, we would call that a career. He had to leave his elect role as the chief consort of effectively the king at the time. He had to leave all of that behind. He had to leave the limelight and disappear. So he effectively disappears off the face of the earth. He goes off on a long journey. He travels most of the known Muslim world at the time. He spends 2 years in Damascus at the Grand Umayyad Masjid. If any of you have been there, it's a beautiful place. And if you're there in the courtyard, it's quite something. And it's quite something to imagine the greatest scholar on earth, Al-Imam Al-Ghazali, for 2 whole years, unbeknown to anybody. The people there didn't know who he was, because of course they didn't have media at the time, so they wouldn't have seen a picture of him. He was sweeping the masjid of the Umayyad mosque. Remember, the masjids were also universities, so he went from this great university to another great university in another town and became the sweeper. So it's a bit like the dean of Oxford University traveling over, having a crisis, traveling over to Harvard and becoming the janitor. It's a bit like that. This is the magnitude of what happened. It's really important to appreciate this. So he decides that in order to remedy the vacuum inside his heart and his soul, he needs to go off on this journey, and he performs Hajj and he performs Umrah. He spends some time in Jerusalem as well, in Masjid al-Aqsa, and it's on this journey that he starts writing the Ihya. So this brings us to the end of the first part of the discussion, and that is his biography and the lessons to learn from that life. Let's now go to the Ihya and talk a little bit about the structure of the Ihya. So the Ihya, as we know, is known in the Muslim world by the common people. The scholars know him for Al-Mustasfa. The common people like us, we know him for the Ihya, the revival of the religious sciences, Ihya Ulum Al-din, which comes in 40 chapters split into 4 quarters. The first quarter is called Rubu' al-Ibadat. In the first chapter, or in the first quarter, he talks about the outward acts of worship. But he wants to talk not about the outward physical actions. It's not a book of fiqh. He talks about the inner meanings of those actions. That's the first section. The second section is called Rubu' al-Adat. And in this, he talks about the things that we do, our practices, outward, the mu'amalat. The adat here means the mu'amalat. So going to work, visiting people, not visiting people, being secluded, staying in isolation. So the kitab al-uzlah, the book of seclusion, is within this ruba', in the second ruba'. And it's just, in fact, it's just after the book of society, the book of the etiquette of being in society. And so it's actually quite important to read Kitab al-Uzlah with the book or the chapter before it, because if you read Kitab al-Uzlah, it can give you the impression, the false impression, that Al-Imam Al-Ghazali is asking all of us to become hermits and to never meet anybody again. This is not what he's saying, because if he were, the previous chapter would not exist. So it's really important to read the whole compendium as a whole and to understand it and balance it. The third rubu', the third quarter, is called al-muhlikat, which literally means the things that destroy, and those are the defects of character that destroy our personalities, destroy our life, and destroy our afterlife. And in there he talks about vices of the heart, things that kill the heart, things like vanity, things like arrogance. But at the core of all of the muhlikat are what he calls delusions. We're not going to go into those chapters, we're going to do that in a separate course. But at the core of it are delusions, and the delusions arise from a lack of the remembrance of death. This is the key lesson from that third rubu'. These delusions, which cause these muhlikat, these vices, or these defects of character, these delusions are caused by not knowing the reality of death, or not apprehending the reality of death. And finally, as would be apt, the fourth quarter is called al-munjiyat, or those things, those virtues that save us from the muhlikat. And there he talks about virtues such as patience and gratitude. And in particular, and this is particularly germane and apt for our situation today, he says that, and many scholars say this, in fact the Qur'an is replete with this theme, which in Quranic terms is called al-qabd and al-bast. So qabd literally means to withhold, and al-bast literally means to release. So Allah, in order to test us during this life, sometimes He withholds things from us in order to test us. So in those times, we call that tribulation. We are tested. We are going through a time today of tribulation where our metal is tested. The metal that we're made of is tested. And in times of tribulation, the virtue that corresponds to tribulation, he mentions, is sabr, as-sabr, patience. And in times of blessing, which is bast, the virtue that corresponds to bast is gratitude. And if we don't have gratitude for the blessings that Allah gives us, then Allah will test us with tribulation, so that we have to exercise patience. And if Allah gives us blessings, this is very important, because the reality is every single one of us here, we have the blessing of attending this program. And if you've attended this program, you have a modicum of resources in your life which probably make you among the wealthiest, in material terms, among the wealthiest part of the whole of human society. So you are blessed, despite what you think. You might look at your neighbor and see that they drive a better car than you, or they have a bigger house than you, but the reality is you are enjoying immense blessing. And if you're a person who's enjoying that blessing, Allah tests you firstly by seeing whether you are grateful. So shukr is the hal, or the virtue that corresponds to blessing. But He will also test you, because it's easy to say thank you. Allah will test your gratitude by sending to you other people who are suffering from constriction and tribulation and who need your help. And so as an act of gratitude to Allah, He wants to see whether you are going to extend some of the blessings Allah has given you, some of the ni'mah, to those who are more in need and are less fortunate than you. This is very, very important to understand. Once I had a friend who's a very wealthy banker, works in the City of London, who's on a salary of, well over £150,000 a year. One of the wealthiest people, one of the wealthiest sector, you might say, of this country's society. In fact, probably the top 1-2% wealthiest people in the world. And you see, the more wealth you have, the more savings you have, and the more savings you have, the more zakat you have to give at the end of the year, which adds up to many thousands of pounds. And so he said to me on one occasion, I find it really hard to give my zakat. You see, because if you're poor, like me, and your zakat is £500 or £1,000 or whatever it is, you might feel, well, as an amount, that's not a great amount. But because his zakat was sometimes tens of thousands of pounds, he said, I find it really hard to give zakat. And I said to him, what you should do to cure this sickness in your heart, he's a very close friend of mine, so I could talk to him like this, to cure the sickness in your heart, this year you should give double the zakat. You calculate your zakat, 2.5%, comes to £10,000, give £20,000. Because if you don't cure that shuh, that miserliness in our hearts, which will withhold the rizq that Allah wishes to give us, because the reality is, Allah says, وَلَئِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ. If you're grateful, not only with your word but with your actions, Allah will give you more. If we withhold, then we don't know what other blessings are being withheld because of our lack of gratitude and our lack of sharing what Allah has given us to others. Right, so that's a brief on the structure of Ihya Ulum Al-din. Now I'm going to go back right to the beginning, to Kitab Al-Ilm, because this is very, very relevant to the whole theme of the book. Now at the beginning of the book, he talks about ilm, and he talks about people he calls the mutarassimun, people of rusum. Rasm or rusum in Arabic, which is the plural, in Arabic means literally a line or the form. So a calligrapher does rasm, he writes because he draws lines, right? So the people of the outward sciences, he calls the mutarassimun. They focus on, is your hand in the right place? Are you facing the right direction? They look at the outward forms of our acts of worship. But what he wants to focus on is the inner spiritual meanings. He wants to focus on what we call the ma'rifah. However, if you look at the book, you'll find that the book is very didactic and full of instructions of what to do. He talks about the inner spiritual attitude we need to have, but it's always coupled with actions. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. And the reason for this is because the Islamic system of spirituality, I'm going to now explain to you why we believe it's a science, is a science. And scientists have to admit, if they're going to call psychology and experimental psychology a science, then spirituality must have the same status. So we have plenty of argument in this day and age, in the age of science and the recognition of psychology as a science, to argue that if we say that under certain conditions, so this is how we control the test, you've got to fulfill these conditions, you've got to have faith and belief in a certain, in God, you've got to follow the tradition given by the Sunnah, and there are certain other preconditions. With those preconditions fulfilled, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will get X results. So this has to be a science. This is why this is called Ilm al-Tasawwuf, or the science of Tasawwuf, or the science of heart knowledge, the science of Ma'rifah. But the science of Ma'rifah is always coupled with an action, which is why in the Islamic tradition, we do have something we call fikr, or contemplation. So there is a place for pure meditation. Prophet Muhammed when he used to go to the Ghar Hira, he used to go there and he used to, in addition to doing physical prostrations and physical acts of worship, he used to do tafakkur or fikr, he used to contemplate. But by and large, you look at our actions, the process of spiritual purification before prayer is coupled with a physical purification using water. The process of spiritual presence before Allah is coupled with physical actions that we perform, of putting our forehead down onto the ground, which symbolizes our submission to Him. And the reason for this is because Islamic spirituality is essentially cognitive behavioral therapy. It's psycho-spirituality, it's experimental psychology that is driven by behavioral science. It's all about the behavior, because Allah has created us as bifurcated creatures. We have a spiritual element and a physical element. It's very difficult for us to directly access our spirit, because the spirit it's limpid, it's not physical, it's not stuff, you can't hold it. Whereas my hand, I can hold my hand, I can do this with my hand, I can take my forehead down to the ground. And so we access the spiritual world through the physical world. And we know this very well, that these two worlds have an interconnection. They have a physical interconnection. So we know that the black stone in the Kaaba, was at one time white. And so I've got a little comment here saying banking is haram. I have said that to him too, so just to reassure you, I'm not promoting or condoning banking as a profession, just for your information. Thank you very much for the comment. So going back to the physical connection with the spiritual, we know that this stone was white and it became black from the sins of the mushrikun who used to touch it. So through physical touching, the negative effect, the vice of their sins, had a physical effect on the actual stone. It's very important to understand this. If we understand this, we'll understand that everything we do in the physical world has a spiritual effect on us. This is essentially what Al-Imam Al-Ghazali is saying to us in his book. Be careful of every single thing that you say and do. Be careful of the company you keep, because the people you meet will have an influence on you. And be careful of where you go. Be careful of the way you think. Everything that we do physically will have an impact on our spirituality. The other thing that runs through the Ihya is the idea of being present. Now, many of us who are Muslims for a long time, we after a while can suffer what we might call a sense of inertia or religious monotony. We pray, and at the end of the prayer, we think, oh, that was over so quickly. What did I do? You know, sometimes you get into your car and you drive along, and 30 minutes later you've arrived at your destination and you don't remember the journey. And that's because you've plied that road many times, and you go into autopilot. You just drive the car and you get to the end of the journey and you don't remember the journey. And sometimes our physical actions can become a bit like that. We get to the end of the journey, we get to the end of the prayer, get to the end of the action, and we feel as though it had no spiritual content. And so one of the things that he talks about is the idea of presence, of bringing presence into our actions by firstly remembering death. So that there's two ways to do this, and this is really interesting as a psycho-spiritual technique. Remembrance of death brings us back to reality. It reminds us that we are going to imminently meet our Creator. This is impending. It's going to happen. It could happen in the next moment. And when we know that, we understand the reality of our existence and our place in the universe, we become present. Another way to become present is actually to go to the other end of the spectrum and to think of ourselves as a beginner. Because, as you know, they say that the beginner's mind or the beginner's presence is marvelous. Why? Because have you seen a beginner drive a car? Yeah, so a beginner drives a car and they're hyper alert. Why? Because they've just learned how to drive and they have to think about every action they do. And that way they want to try to avoid making a mistake. And so if we have a beginner's mentality, then we bring presence back into ourselves, and we imagine we're praying either this is our last prayer or this is our first prayer. And either way, you can bring two types of presence into your being and into your actions. Now, what I'd like to do now is we've talked a little bit about Imam Al-Ghazali's life and the lessons to learn from it. We've talked a little bit about the Ihya as a whole and the project of the Ihya, what it's trying to do. What I'm going to do now is look at some of the language that Al-Imam Al-Ghazali uses. I'm going to share my screen. Here we are. And we've got the beginning or the khutbah of the book of Uzlah, the khutbah of the book of Uzlah. And the reason why I brought this section up is because hidden within it are linguistic techniques or devices or rhetorical devices that Al-Imam Al-Ghazali used and is famous for to bring out what he's going to talk about, what this book is really about. So we've got, this is the 6th book in the Rubu' Al-Adat. Here we have Rubu' Al-Adat. This is the 6th book of the Rubu', the 2nd Rubu' called the Rubu' Al-Adat, the book of practices of Ihya Ulum Al-din. It begins, let's have a read of this. And those of you who've got a bit of Arabic knowledge, you can appreciate some of the Arabic I've got on the left. On the right, I've put my own translation. And I've also highlighted a few words in green, which I'm going to amplify as we read through. So it says, Alhamdulillahi alladhi a'zama an-ni'mata ala khirati khalqihi. Praise be to Allah, the one who has magnified, a'zama, who has magnified his blessing upon khirati khalqihi. Now this is an excellent linguistic device that he uses here, because of course the word khira can refer to a singular or a plural. So the khirati khalqihi wa safwatihi could be a reference to the Prophet Muhammed sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So it is an Islamic tradition that we begin with hamd and then we say salat upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So this is effectively what he's doing in a subtle way at the beginning after hamd of Allah. But of course, khirati khalqihi wa safwatihi can also have a plural meaning, in which case the Sahaba and his family and the Muslims are also included in this. So we are all also beneficiaries of the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So can you see here, with very, very few words, he has combined both of those meanings in khirati khalqihi wa safwatihi. And we all, of course, aspire to be the elect of his creation and his chosen ones. بأن صرف هممهم إلى مؤانسته, by turning their ambitions. And this word himma or himam is the plural of himma, which is your ambition or your drive, your zeal. Many of us, we are very ambitious for things in the world. Many of you would consider yourselves to be, quote unquote, successful people. You have careers, you have ambitions, you achieve those ambitions. Now, for the first time in my life, when I was in my early 20s, when I met my sheikh, he said to me, "What's your ambition?" And I said, "I'd like to become a lawyer." And he said, "No, no, 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 no. What's your ambition? Where do you want to go? What in your spiritual career? What's your himma?" And I was gobsmacked because I'd never heard anybody use the word ambition in that way before. So he uses this word ambition, which the materialists use for physical achievements, material achievements, and he drives it through a spiritual meaning. Ila mu'anasatihi, to have intimacy with him. And Al-Imam Al-Ghazali uses this word, or derivatives of this word, or cognates of this word mu'anasa later on in this khutbah. So it's really important to understand that the word mu'anasa, I've translated here as intimacy, or closeness, or comfort. And why is this important? Why is this word used in the khutbah of the book on uzlah? Because some of us, when we're alone, we feel like a fish out of water. Sometimes when we are alone, we get depressed, we feel uncomfortable, we don't feel right about ourselves. And we're in this time now when we are in uzlah, in enforced seclusion or isolation, and mental health issues are coming out. Whereas a person who has intimacy with Allah in seclusion and is ambitious for that intimacy will find that they're just working on their career. When they're alone, they're working on their career. So this, let's keep an eye on this word mu'anasa. The root is uns. Uns means intimacy. And as you know, the word mu'anasa is from the verb anasa yu'anisu, which is a verbal form in Arabic which suggests reciprocity. And so can you see in the use of the word mu'anasa, and if you look down below to the left, you'll see mushahada. Al-Imam Al-Ghazali, again, the master of words, he's using this type of verbal noun which suggests reciprocity, because the mu'anasa is two ways. We exercise mu'anasa with Allah. We want to be intimate with him, and he comes towards us because we've gone towards him, and he gives us mu'anasa with him. And so there's this reciprocity meaning in this word mu'anasa. Then he says wa ajzala, and the word ajzala you recognize from, sometimes we say shukran jazilan, the jazal, which means being much or copious. I've translated it as expanded. Wa ajzala hadhahum, and he has expanded their fortune. Can you see how he's using the words of the dahriyun? He's using the words himma, he's using the words hadh, but he's appropriating them and putting them into a spiritual context. This is quite masterfully done. You have to understand the sort of the context in which he's writing. وَأَجَّلَ حَظَّهُمْ مِنَ التَّلَذُّذِ بِمُشَاهَدَةِ آلَائِهِ وَعَظَمَتِهِ. Again, we've got this mushahada. Mushahada literally means to see directly with your own very own eyes. This is the meaning of mushahada. And so Allah has given them the opportunity or the good fortune of enjoying seeing. Enjoying seeing. And the word mushahada is very important here because, of course, we have what we call the basar, but the people of tasawwuf, they also talk about the basira, the inside eye, the eye of the heart or the spirit that can contemplate and be in the presence of Allah. And we have this in the hadith of ihsan of the Prophet Muhammed ﷺ, where he says that the person who achieves ihsan, he worships Allah as though he can see him, as though he has mushahada. Next he says وَرَوَّحَ أَسْرَارَهُمْ, and he revived. The word rawwaha means to revive or revivify. وَرَوَّحَ أَسْرَارَهُمْ, he gave life, he revived. And you see the word rawwaha comes from the word ruh, which is your spirit. You can see he gives life to your spirit. There's a double meaning here. Asrarahum. Asrar comes from the word sir. As you know, the word sir means secret, but it also means your spirit, your inner secret, your heart. So he gives life to their spirits. Bimunajatihi, again that form, that mufa'ala form of reciprocity. Bimunajatihi, with private prayer. So the munajat are the prayers that you do when you're secluded and on your own. That's your munajat. Wa mulatafatihi, and subtle devotion. So mulatafa means to make offerings in order to please another person. And so we make offerings to Allah to gain His pleasure. We do mulatafa, and He does mulatafa back to us by appearing to us, giving us presence in His presence, not physical appearance in the dunya. Sorry, of course Allah does not have physical presence, but we don't see Allah with our eyes in the dunya. We'll see Him inshallah in Jannah. But the presence of the mulatafa is Allah manifesting His presence to us in His sifa of being al-latif, being the one who is subtly kind. And then he says, وَحَقَّرَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ, and this is the state of the people who are able to benefit from seclusion. And we're going to talk a little bit later about those who can benefit from seclusion and those who can't. وَحَقَّرَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ النَّظَرَ إِلَى مَتَاعِ الدُّنْيَا وَزَهْرَتِهَا, and he has made debased, deprecated in their hearts النَّظَرَ إِلَى مَتَاعِ الدُّنْيَا. Nazar literally means looking at the stuff. The mata' means the stuff of this dunya. Wa zahratiha, and you could read that wa zuhratiha. So zahra means splendor, and zuhra also means splendor. Zahra, as you know, also means a flower. And the word nazar is very important here, because nazar also not only means looking at, but it also means expecting and waiting for. And so those of us who look at something, we see this Range Rover driving past us, we look at it, and then we want it, we expect it, and we follow it, and wait for it to happen, and we have ambition for it. So can you see this whole materialistic view of nazar, of looking and expecting and waiting, he's captured in this one word nazar. And he says that these people who enjoy seclusion, they debase, they hate, because Allah has made hateful in their hearts to look and to want and expect anything from the stuff of the world. حَتَّى اِغْتَبَطَ بِعُزْلَتِهِ, and so this is the result. So that, and the word hatta, of course, as you know, can mean in order to or so, but it can also mean until. So Allah gives them these ahwal, these states, until they the channels of their thoughts. And this is really important. This comes back to the science of experimental psychology or psychospirituality. Our thoughts have channels. The more times you let a channel of thought flow through your mind, the more etched and more ingrained it becomes in your mind. And so it becomes a part of your thought process. Just the way that if you keep walking over the grass in a certain direction again and again, after a while you get a path, and that path becomes permanent. And like that, our thoughts become permanent pathways or channels. And if those pathways are corrupt, then our minds become corrupt. And the only way to deal with those channels and to overcome them, to replace them, is to use psycho-spiritual techniques, which he talks about later. I don't know if we'll have much time to talk about these things, but one of those things is to use a process called stop and change your thoughts, not with new thoughts, but with actions. So this is a process, this is a psycho-spiritual technique, which is very similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, where if you have a negative thought, or you have a haram thought, or you keep thinking about a person who's haram to you, then it's very difficult to overcome that thought. Or if you keep desiring the neighbor's car, it's very difficult, or something else the neighbor has, or neighbor's flat screen TV, or something else material, maybe something you might consider less base than a TV screen. But even if you have envy of a person, or you have negative thoughts, you have thoughts that negative envious thoughts, you'd like them to have less of what they have, and you'd like to have more of what they've got. You have various vices and sicknesses in our hearts, in order to get rid of them, it's very difficult to just want them to go away, because they're habitual. And if they've been entrenched through habit, we have to now remove them through creating new habits. Old habits have to be replaced by new habits. You can't leave a vacuum. And so what we do is we take a box like this. I call this the handover box. This is my handover box, yeah. I have a handover box like this, and you keep it on your table. So it's got to be a physical box. It's not a box in your mind, it's a physical box. And you have post-it notes. This is psycho-spirituality. It's very, very practical. Everything that Ihya is extremely practical. It's as practical as post-it notes and a pencil. And every time you get that thought, you write it down. You write down the thought. And then you do istighfar. You close your eyes, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. You peel it off. And then you put it in your box. Take your box like this. You put it in your box like that. And then you pick up your box and you hand the box over to Allah. You say, oh Allah, I hand over my sin, or I hand over my negative thought. This can work for depression as well. Allah, I hand over my depression to you, for you to destroy and replace with virtuous deeds. And you say, Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakeel, astaghfirullah, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, wa ufawwidu amri ila Allah. I hand over my matter to Allah. This is essentially a physical manifestation of the spiritual act of tawakkul, of relying upon Allah. Tawakkul literally means to hand over your affairs to Allah, because He will take care of them. This is a psycho-spiritual technique. The Ihya is full of these psycho-spiritual techniques all over the place. Right, so I'm going to now skip the rest of this, and we've got a lot of material here. What I will do is I will ask Brother Rupon in the follow-up email to send you a copy of this, because there's some marvelous things that Al-Imam Al-Ghazali says in these few sections that I've selected. I've got about 5 pages of this. And I'm going to move over now to the end of his khutbah, where he says, and we must never ever forget this, we must always remember to say salat upon the Prophet Muhammed sallallahu alayhi wasallam, because every dua is mawquf. As you know, every dua that you make rises up and it stops. It stops, it does not go up to heaven until you make salat upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And there was a very famous hadith in which one of his companions said to him sallallahu alayhi wasallam, how much of my dhikr or my azkar, how much of my munajat should I devote to you? As in, how much of it should I spend saying salat upon you? As you know, the word salat, when we do salat upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is to invoke Allah's mercy. The meaning of salat there is Allah's mercy upon him. All right, and when Allah says, Inna Allah wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi, that's Allah sending His mercy upon him, and the angels asking Allah to send His mercy upon him. So we say, and he ends with وَالصَّلَاةُ عَلَى سَيِّدِنَا مُحَمَّدٍ سَيِّدِ أَنْبِيَائِهِ, and so on. So the salat upon the Prophet Muhammad at the end. There's a lot of other green highlights in my script here, but I don't have time to go through that now. Got about 10 minutes left before we finish off. And then he begins the book itself. So he says, أَمَّا بَعْدُ فَإِنَّ لِلنَّاسِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا فِي الْعُزْلَةِ. And he says, the people of knowledge, the nas here, he means the people of knowledge, have much disagreement in relation to seclusion and in relation to keeping of society, and which is better. And he says, neither is free from dangers, and these dangers either warn against seclusion, or there are benefits which draw us to seclusion. So what are the dangers of seclusion and what are the benefits? Now at the end of this chapter he talks about various dangers, but I'm going to focus in the next 10 minutes on the 3 key benefits of seclusion that he mentions in the book. Before that, he has a discussion at the beginning of this chapter on the various views of the scholars on whether we should spend more time in the company of people or more time in seclusion. And he concludes that we should spend more time actually in seclusion. Remember, this is a time in his life when he was the top of the top. He was top cat. And he's very deprecating. He has no time for the scholars of the outward sciences, and he has no inhibitions to call them hypocrites, because he says, look, I was among you, I was the best among you, and I knew myself that I had this hypocrisy in my own heart, because I was giving precedence and prevalence to outward sciences, but forgetting the inward. So he's an iconoclast at heart. He's willing to sweep away those who do not give enough attention to the inward. And his conclusion, of course, is that we must spend more time in seclusion with Allah. Now, there's two words that he brings up in this introduction, actually, that I want to flag up, because there's two words he uses for seclusion. One is khalwa, so the word khalwa is used there. And of course, earlier on, he uses the word uzlah. In fact, the book is called Kitab Uzlah. What's the difference between uzlah and khalwa? The word uzlah suggests that you remove, it has a meaning of removal. You remove yourself from society to the point when you're alone. So uzlah suggests that there's nobody else around you, not your wife, not your children, not your mother, not your father. You're alone. The word khalwa means also seclusion, but it could be seclusion with another person. So the word khalwa here suggests that you're alone from you have uzlah from society, but you have khalwa with Allah. So can you see? He starts off with uzlah, but then emphasizes the word khalwa here. And as you see, I've translated this as in his seclusion with him. This pronoun khalwatihi, you could read two ways. And I've translated it into English with two separate pronouns, you see, to try to amplify the beautiful and succinct use of a simple pronoun here to suggest that it's his seclusion, as in the human seclusion, with him, with Allah. So there's another person in the room, yeah, as the verse in the Qur'an says, when Prophet Muhammed ﷺ and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu were in the cave, Allah was with them. Okay, there's a lovely use of language here. Al-unsu bil-insi. This in Arabic, this is a rhetorical device called jinas. This is actually something called, if you study the science of balagha, and in some of the higher level classes that I teach, we teach ilm al-balagha. We teach the Islamic sciences in Arabic. So I'm a firm believer that if you're going to study the Alamiya program, you should strengthen your Arabic first, spend a good amount of time becoming very strong at the Arabic, and then study the Islamic sciences in Arabic medium where there's no English. Yeah. So we teach a course in balagha, which is essential for a scholar. You must understand balagha because the Quran is full of balagha. In fact, the basic miracle of the Quran is i'jaz balaghi. It's a linguistic miracle. And to really appreciate that, you must be a linguist. You must understand language. And here he uses this rhetorical device called jinas naqis, which is an incomplete assonance. You could call this an incomplete assonance. It says وَاسْتَوْحَشَ بِذَلِكَ عَنِ الْأُنْسِ بِالْإِنْسِ. And he becomes estranged. The word istawhasha, as you know, comes from the root wahasha. And wahasha is a word we use for wild animals. وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ. And when the wild animals are resurrected. And so it's kind of strange to see this word istawhasha to mean become estranged. But the word istawhasha in Arabic means to feel lonely as well. Because you see, you will yearn to see your mum, will yearn to see your dad, will yearn to see your children, will yearn to see your wife. It's natural. You're going to have istihash of society. But at the same time, the word istawhasha has another meaning, which means to become separated and estranged from them. So despite the fact that you have a natural yearning for your family and for society, which is natural, and you have responsibilities to them too, so we don't forget those, at the same time, you do accept that you separate from them, you have istihash of them. Why? Because al-unsu bil-insi is not your objective. Uns means intimacy and ins means human beings. And the great female scholar called Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, who was a contemporary of Hasan al-Basri in Basra in Iraq, she has a famous poem in which she says, لَقَدْ جَعَلْتُكَ فِي الْفُؤَادِ مُحَدِّثِي. So she's addressing Allah. She said, I have made you in my fu'ad, in my heart, muhaddithi, the person who speaks to me. وَأَبَحْتُ جِسْمِي مَنْ أَرَادَ جُلُوسِي. And I have made my body available to those who wish to sit beside me. So I've made you my consort, the only one who speaks to my heart, while my body is free for those who are sitting around me, keeping my company. فَإِنَّ الْجِسْمَ لِلْجَلِيسِ مُؤَانِسٌ. See that reciprocal form again? Because the body is for the one who sits with me a comfort. لأن الجسم للجليس مؤانس وحبيب القلب في الفؤاد أنيسي. But the one that my heart loves is in my heart my comfort, the person who gives me comfort, Anis. Let's now go to chapter 1. He has a discussion here about the different views on uzlah, and he begins by quoting some of the statements of the great scholars in history and the Sahaba. For example, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, because of his father as well, we invoke rida of Allah on both of them. He says, أفضل المجالس مجلس في قعر بيتك. He says, the best of councils, best meetings or best sitting places are those in the depths of your own home, where you see nobody and nobody sees you. That's the place where you have private counsel with God. Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu, on the contrary, there's a view to the contrary, and this is based on, for example, the hadith of Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu, in which he says that the Prophet ﷺ said that ash-shaytanu dhi'bul insan. Inna ash-shaytana dhi'bul insani ka dhi'bil ghanami. The shaitan is like a wolf to man, like a wolf is to sheep. He takes the one that is isolated and in the sidelines and lost. So the Prophet ﷺ commands us to be with the community and not to stay away in silos. And Al-Imam Al-Ghazali, very interestingly, his explanation for this is here. He says, وَهَذَا إِنَّمَا أَرَادَ بِهِ مَنْ اعْتَزَلَ قَبْلَ تَمَامِ الْعِلْمِ. He says, this is intended to refer only to those who seclude themselves before their knowledge is complete. So there are different levels of people. We must beware and understand this in context, because there are some people, when they're alone, they commit more sins. That's the other extreme. So if somebody is in danger of committing sins when they're alone, then they have some of those muhlikat in the 4th quarter of the book. They have those diseases of the heart. They need to cure those diseases first. They shouldn't be alone. They should be with someone else who's helping them overcome. They should be on a training program, on a recovery program, helping them to overcome those diseases in their behavior, in their hearts. So this view that he has, he makes it very clear at the beginning, is only for those who have completed they have grounding, they have tamakkun, they have grounding in their knowledge, which here he uses the word ilm, and he means by this not just information, but they have the ilmul ma'rifah, they have the knowledge of spiritual presence with Allah, so that in their seclusion, far from committing sins, they will worship Allah and be present with Him. In chapter 2, he talks about the various benefits of uzlah, and here I have 3 of them. The first benefit is that it frees you for the worship of Allah and contemplation in seeking His intimacy. This is very, very important. Sometimes, especially those of us who are born and bred activists, we go out and we organize many things, and we do so many things for society. We spend our time saving the world, and yet we have very little time to save ourselves. And so he says the important benefit of uzlah or khalwa is that it gives you some self-time. It gives you intimacy with Allah, where everything slows down, everything stops, where other people are sleeping, you're the only person who is awake, and you have lots of time, and your ego is weak. At a time when you're alone, your ego is weak, because when you're in people's presence, you have the danger of ri'a, and that brings us to the second one, the second benefit. The second benefit is escaping from the disobediences, such as backbiting, tale-telling, showing off, and failing to command good and forbid evil. And the last one is very, very important. He says, and this is the Arabic, وَمُسَارَقَةُ الطَّبْعِ مِنَ الْأَخْلَاقِ الرَّدِيئَةِ. Musaraqa, those of you who know the word sariqa, which means stealing, musaraqa means to infiltrate through stealth. So if we spend time in the company of other people, then we expose ourselves to their bad habits and their bad behaviors. And by exposure, we become desensitized and our nature becomes corrupted. We become denatured over time without realizing. And by keeping seclusion and not going to too many outward events, we benefit from not only keeping the company of God, but also avoiding the company of those who will denature our characters. That's the second benefit. And finally, the third benefit is al-khalasu min al-fitani wal-khusumati. You'll notice here by the end I've stopped putting the vowels in the Arabic, because our advanced students, we learn how to read without vowels. If you want to learn Arabic as Arabic, except for obviously in the Qur'an we put the vowels in. The vowels are there to prevent people reading it wrong. But most Arabic books, the books of knowledge, are written without vowels. So you've got to be a master at reading without vowels. Here, al-khalasu min al-fitani wal-khusumati, escaping from strife and disputes. Because a lot of the time we meet people and the bad character in us comes out, the bad character in them comes out, and we end up having arguments. We have arguments, and those arguments often roll into further arguments, and we sometimes forget why we're arguing, and it's an aggrandizement of our egos. It's a way of growing our egos, and of course our egos are the opposite of submission, because when we allow our egos to be inflated, we are not submitting to Allah. And that's the third key benefit. Now, of course, the book is quite long, and the whole book is quite copious. It's several volumes. It can fill a whole shelf. And so we haven't done justice to even this particular chapter of the book. But what I did here is just highlighted some of the key points that Al-Imam Al-Ghazali brings up in this chapter called Kitab Uzlah. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'd like to hand back over to Rupon to conclude the webinar for today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam. Let me see if I can get on. Ustadh, you need to pass me the video.